TV Ed. One of the most fascinating aspects of visiting a museum, any museum, is that you get to see where things have come from. In today's program, we're going to look at some interesting aspects of a device that you're all very familiar with, and that's a bicycle. Now, you may know the sort of bicycle you've got now, but do you know where it came from? Well, luckily, we've got two experts in the studio with us today who know all about the history of bicycles through the years. And that's Bill Sidebottom, who's the curator for engineering and transport at the Museum of Victoria, and Doug McCann, who's one of the education officers also at the museum. Welcome to the program to both of you.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you very much.
Tell us something about the collection of bicycles at the museum, Bill.
Yes, it's a fairly small collection, Trevor, but it covers a great deal of development in the last 120 years or so. We haven't certainly got examples of every bike ever made, but what we'd like to show today is the range of developments of bicycles.
Excellent. You're holding this particular one very carefully.
Yes, this is perhaps the oldest bike that we have in the collection. There were older bikes elsewhere in the world, but this one is fitted with pedals. Prior to this, there was a bicycle called a hobby horse. It didn't have pedals, you simply sat astride it and pushed yourself along on the ground. This one is sometimes referred to as a farmer's bike, but it isn't that. It's simply slightly agricultural, perhaps.
And where does this particular example come from?
This probably is about 1860 or thereabouts. Pedals were developed at about that time. And as we go through the bikes, perhaps we could point out some of the mechanical features of each. And
let's start with some of the mechanics of this bike.
Yes.
One of the most obvious points about it, I think, is that it's made of wood and metal, and that the wheels are different sizes.
Yes. One of the reasons for having a fairly large front wheel is that until the chain wheel was invented, pedals were connected directly to the front wheel, which meant that every motion of the foot was corresponded to one revolution of the wheel. So the bigger the wheel, the faster you went, or the further you went in one revolution. And we'll see later how big wheels can get. But the construction here is largely that of the coach builder. And you'll notice that the wheels are rather wagon-type wheels. And each of the spokes is fitted very carefully into a hub, which probably turned on a lathe. They're shaped, and the wheels act in compression, so that the weight of the rider bears downwards on the bottom spokes.
Right. It looks homemade, is it?
No, almost certainly not. All of these pieces of metal required hot forging, piercing here in special blacksmith's tools and with special blacksmith tools. The bearings, although they're unsophisticated, could not have been made in anybody's home at that time.
Right. How easy was it to ride? It looks a bit strange, I think.
Yes, fairly heavy going, but nevertheless the excitement at the time must have been very great, I suspect.
Doug, what sort of people would have ridden a bicycle like this in the 1860s? Would it have been a fairly common means of transport or not?
No, it did come in fashion for a while, but it would have been fairly expensive to build one of these bicycles. So probably somebody who was fairly rich would have to have owned this particular bicycle.
Is there a comparison that you could make? Would it have cost, say, as much as a car might cost someone today, or what?
Oh no, I think it'd be cheaper than a car, much cheaper than a car. But nevertheless, the average person wouldn't have owned one of these bicycles.
Doug, with the metal around the wheels and a rather hard-looking wooden seat, was it comfortable to ride?
Well, as you can see with this iron tyre, it would have been a fairly rough ride. The seat actually was padded with horsehair, so that would have been fairly comfortable. The roads in those days, in the early days of the colony, they had quite good roads, but with a wheel this size, it would have been a fairly rough ride.
Right, excellent. Now, this represents a very early example of bicycle technology. What is it called? Is it called a bicycle?
Well, this particular bicycle was actually nicknamed the Bone Shaker for obvious reasons.
Yes, I was going to say, it doesn't really look as though it offers much comfort for money. What was the next development in bicycle technology after this one?
Well, as Bill mentioned previously, you notice the front wheel on this particular bicycle is bigger than the back wheel. Now, the reason for that is that the bike would actually go faster, as Bill said. Later on, we had bicycles developing with larger and larger front wheels until we got to this style of bicycle, which is actually called a high wheel bicycle. This particular bicycle was built in Ballarat by a blacksmith.
And what features are an advance over the Bone Shaker that we saw? Obviously it's a different shape. There doesn't seem to be any wood in this particular one.
Well, there is a bit of wood. The seat is made out of wood and the handlebars, or part of the handlebars, but most of the bike itself is actually made out of iron.
which would have made it very heavy, I presume.
It's a very heavy bicycle, actually.
Still with the pedals at the front, would that have been easy to ride or not?
Well, it was hard to get onto the bicycle, but once you got on and started pedalling, it was quite a comfortable ride.
And what sort of people used bicycles like this? Was it used for commuting from home to work or just for pleasure or what?
No, not normally. I think mainly in those days it was used for sport and for pleasure, not so much for commuting.
Now, you said that once you got on the bicycle and got started, it was a reasonably easy ride for the bicyclist. What about stopping?
Well, stopping perhaps wasn't quite so hard. It's actually getting the bike moving that's the difficult thing. But if you want to stop, then you just lift your leg over the wheel and you can get down quite easily.
What, you fall off?
No, you don't fall off, hopefully, although a lot of people
Would
did.
you fall off carefully?
That's right.
So the brake is yourself?
Well, most of the bikes in those days did have brakes. This particular one doesn't. We don't know why. Maybe it had a brake on and it was taken off, but yes, most bikes would have had brakes in those days.
So there's a real art. If people think it's hard to learn to ride a bicycle now, it would have been a bit harder then. What year was this one again?
This was 1872.
1872. And an Australian example?
This is a good example of a locally built bike, actually. A lot of bicycles in those days were actually built from imported parts from overseas.
Right. And it looks very much like a penny farthing. I've seen those in books before. But you're saying it's not. It's a high wheel bicycle.
No, this is sort of an intermediate stage between the bone shaker and the penny farthing. You'll notice this back wheel here is still a reasonable size. If you have a look at a penny farthing, you'll notice the back wheel is much smaller than that, although the front wheel would be much the same.
Right. Well, I saw something over here that I think is probably worth having a look at. Now, is this what you meant by a penny farthing?
That's right. That's a good example of a penny farthing, actually.
And this, I believe, comes from a private collection in Melbourne.
That's right. Well, I'll get Bill to talk about that if you like.
Certainly. This is an aerial, Trevor, and manufactured in England and the aerial company started about 1872, but this bike was made about 1875 and is called a penny farthing because of the relative size of the rear wheel and the large wheel. As I mentioned earlier, the reason for the large front wheel is to get a higher velocity for the same pedal speed. And the reason also for this saddle being almost above the pedals is to get greater effective use of the body weight. Right. Now, the closer the body is to the handlebars, of course, the more dangerous it is because the slightest obstruction to the front wheel and over you go. And I have seen a gentleman recently with one broken arm following an accident riding one of these.
I should think last century that was a lot more common.
I expect so, yes.
Would you get on a bicycle like this? Someone who's your height would probably find it a lot easier.
I've never ridden one, but one stands beside there, and if I may, on here, push forward and off you go.
Oh, all right. And, I'll believe you. I'm not going to try it. Well, that's how you get started. The same question again. How would you stop safely?
In this particular bike, it has an unusual brake in that it has a little pedal operated roller there, and used to be operated by a twist grip on the handlebars, but presently the cord terminates without that grip. Others had a spoon brake which operated on the top and the front of the front wheel.
And what, just pressed against
and
the
just pressed
wheel?
Against the wheel.
This bicycle is a lot lighter in construction than the previous one. The spokes are thinner. The wheel no longer is made of metal. It's a rubber tyre.
Yes.
Are there any other technological advances?
Well, you'll notice that the first bicycle we looked at had wooden spokes in compression, and we then passed to metal spokes in tension, and these are now wire spokes in tension with adjustment at the centre hub. There's also provision in the centre for a light to hang from the front axle, although we haven't got one here today.
So this is getting closer to the sort of construction of wheels that people riding bicycles today would be familiar with.
But you'll notice that the spokes here still pass through the diameter of the front wheel. They're not diametrically laced, tangentially laced, but we'll see that later. The other thing is this bike still has bushes for all its bearings, but it's becoming much more sophisticated at the head stem here. At the head.
For me and other people, explain that.
You'll remember that on the Ballarat bicycle, it was just a simple tubular bearing here, and now we have an aerial design which has two side pieces, a very nice adjustable bearing in the middle, adjustable handlebars, sprung wheel here, generally more sophisticated in approach. And for lightness, the rear frame is tapered off.
I said earlier, Doug, that I knew the term penny farthing. I've seen that in books and mentioned. People would be quite familiar that a bicycle craze was first started and based around these, or am I wrong?
Well, yes, that's right. Around about 100 years ago, actually, the penny farthing had reached its peak in popularity, and it was known in those days as the high wheel bicycle or ordinary bicycle, particularly when they developed the new safety bicycles, the modern bicycle. This was known as the ordinary bicycle in comparison with that new development.
You told me you had some photographs that showed some important aspects about the history of bicycles. Can you explain what they showed?
Right, well, the ride on this particular bicycle was fairly comfortable, actually. The larger the wheel, the more comfortable the ride on the bicycle. This particular photograph here shows a race taking place in Melbourne in the exhibition buildings.
What year was that?
It was around about around about 100 years ago, the 1870s.
And it looks like it's a rather popular spectator sport. Was that typical of the time?
Well, actually, bicycle races were the most popular sport of last century. Tens of thousands of people used to turn up to watch bicycle races.
What, fall off and break their arms?
Well, it was fairly exciting, yes.
And this one shows what?
That shows you two riders on a penny farthing going downhill. This was actually known as coasting, and they would hang their legs over the handlebars just in case they hit a bump or something and they came off the bicycle.
Oh, what about the pedestrians?
Well, unfortunately, that was bad luck for the pedestrians. I think you'd find that there were lots of accidents and lots of broken arms. The police actually didn't like this particular practice and they banned it, but the bicycle clubs thought it was a pretty good practice to put your legs over the handlebars.
Were bicycle clubs starting to become popular 100 years ago?
Yes, well, most people who bought a bicycle would actually join a bicycle club. It was a sport for perhaps middle-class, rich young men. And most of the photographs you see are actually young men riding these particular bicycles.
Well, our penny farthing's gone and looks like it's been replaced by tuppence halfpenny. And all those people who are only familiar with metric currency can ask their parents about that. But what is this? This is most intriguing.
Well, this is a three-wheeled cycle, so we'll call it a tricycle. And tricycles, round about 100 years ago, in fact, it coincided with the peak of the penny farthings, the peak of popularity with the penny farthing. Tricycles became popular.
So why were tricycles built? Why did they become popular?
Well, tricycles had been around for a while. Children in particular rode tricycles. But the penny farthing brought on an interest in cycling. And there was one problem with that for women. The clothing in those days, the dresses they wore, went all the way down to the ground, and it made it difficult for women to ride penny farthings. So there was a pressure to develop some other form of cycling for women, and the tricycle was perhaps one development of that.
Right, Bill, I noticed there's a chain on this particular bicycle. Is that a new development?
Relatively new, but you'll notice they haven't taken advantage of the fact that they could have had a larger sprocket on the drive wheel and increased the speed, although for a tricycle perhaps speed wasn't important. But this is a very nicely made example. It has some very fine engineering of the steering mechanism. You can see how that works.
Could I get you to explain that? Because there are two handles, but they're two different handles.
Yes. This handle is to steady the rider, and that handle is for steering the back wheel. And you notice you turn to the left and you go to the left, and to the right you go to the right. Also, the mechanical advantage of the steering system can be changed, as we can have two positions there for that link. I'm not sure that this has roller bearings in it, or ball bearings. I think it's probably still sleeve bearings, but still we have the iron spokes, and these are not adjustable. You notice they're cast into the hubs.
And forgive me asking,
Yes.
which is the front, which is the back?
Well, I can demonstrate it if you like.
Yes, thank you.
You actually would sit up on a seat like this, put your feet on the pedals like that, balance it. That would be just a pedal there to balance yourself, and you would steer with this handle here.
Oh, right. Actually, it looks like good fun. Have you tried it out at the museum? Is it easy to ride?
Well, I'm actually a bit heavy for this particular tricycle. It was a lady's tricycle built in 1886.
Were tricycles mainly made for women to ride?
Well, there was pressure for women to have some sort of cycle, and so I guess that's what brought the interest in tricycles.
This footage, I believe, is from the turn of the century. And are these typical of the sorts of bicycles that were popular then?
Yes, the safety bicycle, as it was known, the modern bicycle, was developed the same time as we had the tricycles and the penny farthing. So 100 years ago was a very active time in development of cycles, and the safety bike became popular.
There seems to have been a big leap in a short period of years from the styles of bicycle we've seen so far and those in the film, which are very similar to the bikes we're familiar with today, except maybe BMXs. What was it due to? Was it due to rubber technology, chains, popularity, or what?
Probably a combination of social factors. I think in the last decade of last century, cycling suddenly became popular with everyone, men, women and children. It was a way that people could get away from their homes, and it was a fairly cheap form of transport.
Bill, this example is not new, I can tell, but I can't tell how old it is.
We don't know either. It belonged to a former caretaker in the Museum of Victoria, and we inherited it from him. And it looks to me as though it's about 1930s, might be a little bit later, and it belonged to his daughter. But there are some features of this which point out the difference between the early bike
Go for it.
and the modern bike. This is a lady's bike, so you had, again, because of the dress reasons that Doug had mentioned, you have a step-through frame. Secondly, although it isn't here, the rear mudguard has a lot of holes in it so that you can have a lace netting down to the forks to stop dresses getting tangled in the chain system. And the major difference, of course, is the fact that we now are able to generate a high speed at the back wheel by having a large chain wheel and a small rear sprocket.
Maybe that bears a bit of explanation as to exactly how it works. Can we do that?
Yes, certainly. Probably best to turn it over.
Right.
And
curators at the museum earn their money, people.
now, as this is pedalling the reverse way, you'll notice that one revolution of the chain wheel will cause several revolutions of the rear sprocket, according to the number of teeth on this and on that. You'll also notice a very important change also, and that is the back pedal brake. And that is an ED brake. Many people manufactured them, but this was a well-known one. Now, today's bikes, of course, normally don't have that sort of brake. They have the caliper brakes. But that was of major importance, as were the pneumatic tyres.
And you made a point earlier about the arrangement of the spokes. And
Yes.
these, I notice, don't radiate from the hub. They seem to go off slightly to one tangent.
Now, what that means is that torque can be applied to the rear wheel and braking forces to the front wheel, and that is resisted by pure tension in a tangential mode at the hub. If they were to come straight in here, there is an enormous force on the spokes tending to break them, much greater than as they are now. So that lacing pattern is quite important, and it varies according to style of bike.
The tyres that we've seen earlier began as metal over wood, then became solid rubber. These are similar to pneumatic tyres today, I
Yes.
presume.
These are standard type with a separate tube inside and fairly large section. Racing bikes, of course, have what are called singles, and they're glued on and much smaller and higher pressure.
Was this sort of bicycle made in Australia, Doug?
Yes, this is actually a locally made bicycle in Melbourne.
Right. And very common, you were saying. About how many bicycles would have been on the roads any time in the earlier part of this century?
I'm not sure.
You said they were common.
I'm not sure the figure for Australia, but in the United States, for instance, over 1 million bicycles were selling each year, around about 1900.
That's a lot of bicycles, given the population at the time. Let's turn this back up the right way, because there's another bicycle I saw out there that I'm dying to have a look at and learn more about. Replace swaps. Now, Bill, this doesn't look like any bicycle I've ever seen before, except that it's got two wheels and handles.
Right. Now, that's a recent acquisition for the museum. It's also made by Healing, a Victorian manufacturer. And shortly after the end of World War II, there was a great interest in low-cost motoring, and the directions taken were in bubble cars, three-wheeler motor cars, light motorcycles, and there was a projection that push bikes would have motors fitted to them. Healings and Malvern Star both created a few examples, but they didn't proceed. And I think the reason was that we had a fairly affluent society and everybody aimed at having a motor car.
So were there many companies making these sort of bicycles in Australia?
None in Australia, but what happened was that both Malvern Star and Healings imported the motors and fitted them to their own frames.
Oh,
now, this is a Waco motor from England. Malvern Star used a Villiers motor, but what's unusual about this is that the motor system is inside the back wheel. And I don't know whether viewers would like to see the other side of it, but they could see the carburetor.
Well, I do, so...
Yeah. And there is the business side of the motor. Now, this bike had been restored by a former owner. It's not immaculately or authentically restored, but the essence of it is very pleasing to us.
So what are the important aspects of the engine?
Right, it's a power or pedal-assisted motor. I believe this one is about 50 cc's, 50 millilitres, and it is connected to the pedals. It has a ratchet system so that you can't brake with the pedals, but it means the motor can go on and you can freewheel without pedalling once the motor starts.
And what sort of speed and distance was this sort of bicycle capable of?
Well, I suppose it would go all day on next to nothing, but speeds, I expect, would have been about 40 kilometres an hour, something like that.
Why do you think it is that we don't see bicycles like this today?
I think when people want transport, they will use a motor car or public transport. When they want recreation, they're out for exercise and they'll pedal.
Fair enough. The front hub here is larger than normal as well. Is there a reason for that?
Yes. Now, that's a most unusual braking system. For bicycles. It's rather like the motorcycle braking system with internal expanding brake shoes. And that's how it's operated. It's a right-hand
again, a hand grip.
Yes.
Fairly advanced for a bicycle, a lot of technology in it.
Yes.
I would presume maintenance would then become an important aspect of its upkeep as well.
I expect so. However, I think many people who understood the common lawnmower would be able to understand this sort of engine.
I bet a lot of students watching this particular program would be dying to get their hands on a motorised bicycle. Were young people the sort who rode this sort of device, or was it really an adult bicycle?
I really think this was an adult bicycle, and it would have been too expensive for young people at the time.
Really? About how much, do you think?
I don't know, but at least the cost of a motor more than a bicycle.
Puts it out of my price range as well. Yeah. There's one more rather curious-looking bicycle over there that I've got to ask about. Now, this looks like someone washed it in a trank. What sort of bicycle is this, Doug?
Well, this is a Bickerton fold-up bicycle.
I think that explains it all. Why was it built? Was it for a particular reason?
Well, it was built in the early 1960s. Well, the idea began in the 1960s. Actually, this particular bike, I think, was 1977. But we'd reached a bit of a stalemate as far as bicycles were concerned. They'd gone out of fashion, and only really young people actually rode bicycles. But this was an innovation, a small-wheeled bicycle, as opposed to some of the bicycles we had a look at with the very large wheels.
Are there any particular technological innovations in it? I mean, you've said it's folding, but apart from that, is most of the rest of the technology fairly standard?
Well, I guess Bill might be able to comment on that.
Well, one obvious difference is the fact that it's made of a lightweight alloy, and it's a very light bike. Very few bikes had been made of alloy in the past. One had been made by Sir Hubert Opperman in the 30s out of aluminium alloy.
Does that make it a very expensive proposition for people?
Well, a little dearer because of the aluminium. Right. The engineer who designed this worked for Rolls-Royce, and it's a very technically advanced bike.
I wonder where he works now.
I wonder.
You were mentioning about caliper brakes, and I noticed
yes, now this
is fitted with those.
Front and rear caliper brakes. It has a rear reflector and a comfortable saddle, and it's fully adjustable. The height and attitude of the hand grips is adjustable, the seat, but not the pedals.
All right.
And it folds.
So this, apart from specialised bicycles like BMXs that we mentioned earlier, really represents a fairly recent final stage of bicycle evolution so far. Let's just review things. Let's take it backwards in order that we've seen the bike so far. So from the Bickerton we go back to
Well,
a motorised bicycle?
Yes, motorised and that form of bicycle, and then back to the standard safety bicycle.
Which first appeared, Doug, about when?
Well, it developed in about the 1870s, but it really reached its modern form in around about 1885, I'd say.
Right, so there's really a big step back to the previous technological changes. Before the safety bicycle?
Well, we had the penny farthing, the high wheel bicycles with the very large front wheel.
And the tricycles?
Yes, the tricycles around about the same time, around about the mid-1880s.
And stepping back how many years from that to, you called it a bone shaker?
Yes, well that would have been about 25 years before. Yes, in about 1860s we had the bone shaker.
I know before we started this program, Doug, you were talking about the history of the bicycle and the fact that it had a major influence on women in society. Maybe you could explain that to everyone.
Well, in the last 10 years of the last century, when safety bicycles became popular, everybody started riding them. And for the first time, particularly the working classes and women in particular were liberated from their local surroundings, from the homes and so on. And it became a symbol actually of women's liberation in those days. So much so that when women were granted access to degrees at Cambridge, they actually hoisted a bicycle with the effigy of a woman on it just to show that the bicycle represented to them a retrograde step. But for women, of course, it was a great step forward.
It's an interesting aspect of the history of bicycles that I wasn't aware of. Whereabouts can people watching this program learn more about bicycles from? Are there services the museum provides?
Yes, well, we have classes at the museum. Actually, there's an education service at the museum with 12 teachers, and we have classrooms there. We teach all sorts of classes in science and technology, natural history, anthropology, and so schools can actually book into the museum for those classes.
Here's a chance for a commercial. How can they contact you?
Well, they would phone the education service at the museum and make a booking.
And the phone number, just in case people want to ring?
The phone numbers are 6699 or 6699
Right, thank you very much for that. And all I can do is encourage anyone who wants to go to the Museum of Victoria and have a look at some of the incredible displays that they've got there. We haven't got any more time. I think we've got about a minute for the end of the show. See if you can fold the Bickerton up in 1 minute, Doug. I'm not going to help you because I don't know how to. Till next time. See you then. Victorian schools can obtain a copy of this program by sending a blank cassette and a dubbing request form to the Videotape Dubbing Service, Curriculum Branch 234, Queensbury Street in Carlton 3053. Interstate school inquiries can be made on 03 628 2113.